Ben Pearson, the Roser Tracker. It's pretty well known that the Soyuz astronauts carry firearms for when they're landing as a part of their survival kit, just because sometimes they land out in the middle of the wilderness and, you know, there are some nasty critters that live out there, so they may need it for survival. It turns out, though, there have been some even more powerful weapons that have been launched into space by the Americans, and they weren't just into space. They actually put these on the surface of the moon. Yes, that's right. The United States has brought 2 grenade launchers onto the surface of the moon. Let's dig down into the details here. Each of the missions that landed on the surface of the moon, including Apollo 13 that actually didn't, carried with it a seismometer that could be used for years afterwards. This seismometer would measure the vibrations of the moon, and by looking at it, they could figure out what was inside of the moon, what it was made out of. And as a result, we have a fairly good idea of what the moon is actually made out of. These were actually powered by radioactive thermal generators, RTGs, the same types of things that power our spacecraft into deep space, and also power the Curiosity and Perseverance rover. These seismometers were somewhat influential with Apollo 13 landing. They had to make sure that the lunar module would land in somewhere deep ocean because you didn't want that thing to surface and it would survive all the way till impact. Those things are built like a tank. But they wanted to go straight to the bottom of the ocean, and as far as we know, it did. There was a problem with these seismometers. While they were good at recovering, passive types of data, we didn't know how big the objects were that were impacting. We didn't know if it was an internal moonquake. We needed a little bit better data to really figure this out. And there were a couple of different ways that we have done that. First of all, starting with Apollo 13 all the way through Apollo 17, the upper stage of each Saturn V rocket was deliberately crash landed into the moon at a known location. So we knew the mass of it, we knew where it was landing, and you had a calibrated impact. Because Apollo 12's and 14 through 17's seismometers were all active even well after they left, then they were able to get good data. Of course, Apollo 13's never landed on the moon, and Apollo 11's failed fairly shortly thereafter. It's probably why they didn't do that with Apollo 12. So Apollo 13 actually did touch the surface of the moon, the mission, but only the upper stage. Nothing else actually did. So it still got a little bit of science out of there. As the mission were heading home, the upper stage to the Lunar Ascent Module would also crash land into the moon. Usually this was done deliberately, although not in every instance could we actually do it. Probably should have looked it up before I recorded this video, but I do know that the later missions all were deliberately impacted, while Apollo 11 and 12, I believe their upper stages were just kind of let loose. Apollo 11's, it turns out, may actually still be orbiting in the moon, but that's the subject of a Scott Manley video. You can take a look over there if you're interested. So where do explosives come in here? Well, it turns out that having a much more carefully controlled location where these explosions go off would be quite useful. And so they actually put together a mortar, imaged here, that fired off rounds. It was supposed to fire off for Apollo 14, but it did not. It was too close to the science instruments, and they didn't want to risk damaging any of those that were left. The mortar was set up before they actually took off from the moon, so they had to try it again in Apollo 16. Apollo 16 fired 3 of its 4 grenades off. The last one was left on the surface unexploded. So there are 5 grenades of the sort that are on the surface of the moon. Apollo 17 did things a little bit easier. They basically took a explosive and they put a very, very long fuse, a fuse that would take 4 days for it to go off. So they could put these blocks down, and because they were on the moon for a couple of days, they could let them down, they could take off, and then at a later time, then the explosions would happen. And so it was much, much more controlled. You didn't, have the semi-random landing spot, and they could put them in different areas. So that worked out fantastic. None of these explosions went off while the astronauts were there. which is why they had to use the mortar system before they figured it out. They couldn't figure out how to set the timer for so long in such a reliable method. And they didn't want to depend on a radio link because radio links are a little finicky. So they had the setup to command them from the ground, but they only had the mortar that they had to control and not all the rest of the stuff. It's really amazing the kinds of things that they're done, and I love the early space program, some of the crazy things. But grenades on the moon? That one came as a little bit of a shock to me. Talked about nuking the moon before, but grenades actually there was pretty cool. Thanks guys so much for joining me. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. Until next time, keep on tracking. Take care, guys.